So our last speaker for this session is Jan Todd from the University of Texas, and the title of her talk is The Limits of Strength in Human Performance.
Well, I just first of all want to give everybody applause for being here in the last paper of the last day. Thank you for staying. I also want to thank Carl for inviting me to do this. This was a little bit outside my box, as Carl knows, and so it's been a kind of interesting project. But it allowed me an opportunity to think about some things that are interesting and unique to my sort of skill set, which is primarily sport history, for those of you who don't know me. And so this question that he proposed to me was to think about, what do we know about the limits of human performance? And I sort of connected back and said, well, let's think about that in terms of strength and speed, and think about those in particular because I know more about strength than I do, say, ballet dancing. And so the paper that I've sort of put together here, I was thinking about all this, about why is it that so much of my own research has come back time and again to deal with strength. And I think that part of the reason for that is that as a child, when I was growing up, I was an avid reader of comic books. And if you think about your own lives, and I know some of you in this room are somewhere around my age, you may well be that some of you also may have some idea of how important strength is in our portrayals of superheroes in comic books. And so when we think about our comic books, and I think about, for instance, and I'm going to try to make sure I know how to do this, as we think about, the role that physical strength played in making Superman super, in making Thor godlike, in making, and how strength was the gift that was given to both the Incredible Hulk when he was exposed to gamma rays, and it was also, of course, one of the gifts that was given to Captain America. When we think about this sort of notion of strength, it seems to us, to me at least, that it's sort of something that has really begun to sort of pervade our culture in lots of different ways, and so the idea of strength is increasingly interesting to me. Now, in the Marvel comic universe, even superheroes have strength limits. And so, of course, do athletes. Superman could be weakened by kryptonite. Thor wasn't much of a god without his hammer. No matter what the Hulk wanted to do, if he wasn't really enraged, he wasn't going to be able to use all of his strength. And even the super secret serum that was given to Steve Rogers, to skinny Steve Rogers, that then turned him into Captain America, that secret serum did not give him unlimited strength. He had to still train. But it did make him, and this of course is from the Marvel comic universe, it did make him, quote, as strong as a human being could be. Keep that thought in mind. We'll come back to that later. Now, my personal suspicion is that the secret soldier serum, sorry, I blew that, the secret soldier serum, probably is a substance we might want to start thinking about adding to the IOC list. So the point of this somewhat personal digression is not only that it allows me to include a photo of Chris Hemsworth in this presentation, which, as some of you may have just noticed, made us all sort of sit up a little bit more, and some of us have a little smile on our face now. But rather, it actually allowed me the sort of more academically appropriate and intriguing question of how we've thought and how we've talked about the concept of absolute limits to human performance and what role our profession, no matter what name we're calling it at the time, has played in shaping some of those ideas. So the talk that follows will not obviously do justice to all of this terrain in the 30-minute time that we have here, but I'm going to sort of divide it into two parts. The first will focus a little bit more on the early history of strength and how it relates to sports science, and then we'll talk more about the question of limits in the modern era. So part one is called Measuring the Strength of Man. Most histories of biomechanics begin with a strong nod to the work done by Aristotle and Galen in ancient times, and then jump to Leonardo da Vinci. And thank you for playing right into my talk with your presentation. And then they linger over the important work done by Giovanni Borelli in the 1600s, whose De Motu Animalium, which was released just after his death, is considered really to be the first great book in the field. After Borelli, the American Society of Biomechanics president A. Bruce Martin told an audience in 1999. There is, quote, little sign of biomechanics in the literature until the latter half of the 19th century. I'm actually going to disagree with that today. And because I think that overlooked by Martin and other chroniclers of the history of human mechanics, if I can define biomechanics as human mechanics, and maybe I can't, but I'll try, my starting point today would actually be the 17th century scientist, clergyman, John Theophilus Desaguliers, who was a friend to Isaac Newton, who was a fellow in what was then called the Royal Society of London for Improving Natural Knowledge, and he was a man fascinated by the mechanical aspects of human strength. Desaguliers had a wide-ranging mind, and he wrote important papers on all kinds of hydraulics, electricity, levers, the rotation of the planets, and he also wrote about a variety of other topics that were eventually gathered together and published in a massive 2-volume illustrated work called Principles of Natural Philosophy. He became interested in human mechanics in the early 1700s because of strongmen. Because at that time, public fairs were beginning to be held in England, and the growth of taverns meant that there were opportunities for public entertainers. And so jugglers and acrobats and professional strongmen began to appear in London at that time. And Desaguliers, like lots of people, had some discretionary money, and he went to the fair. And what he saw there was very curious. He liked the acrobats, he was interested in the juggling, but the strongmen that he saw posed questions for him, because he wanted to understand how they could be so strong. And also, he wanted to know whether or not what he was seeing, whether the strength that he was looking at was actually real, or was it fake? So Desaguliers writes that his first interest was actually piqued by the tales of William Joy, whom he never saw perform. But Joy reportedly could lift more than a ton of weight, and he was also demonstrated that he could resist the pull of a horse. Now, the only visual evidence that survives suggesting how Joy accomplished such feats is this engraving, and neither I nor Desaguliers want to suggest that we think that he could have lifted a solid chunk of lead that he claimed weighed more than 2,000 pounds by a simple strap around his waist. He's not even really holding on here. About 20 years later, the German strongman Karl von Eckenberg began demonstrating his strength in London, and that was actually in the summer of 1719. He is described, and Desaguliers does meet him, he was described by Desaguliers in different places where he writes about him as a man of middling size. Von Eckenberg actually used in his act, again, several mechanical devices. And in his finale, he stood on a tower, and if you look in the top right corner here, if you look in the top right corner of that, in that tower, you will see that the finale of his act always involves some kind of a harness lift, as it's called. In this case, he's standing up there, there is an enormous cannon below him, and then there is a man playing a drum on the cannon. On the other side, there's a picture, and I know this is hard to see, but this picture actually shows 2 boys on a small pony. Not a full-sized horse, but still, these were big weights that sort of inspired the imagination of people. So, von Eckenberg, using these mechanical devices in his act, raised questions for Desaguliers. And so he went several times that summer when he was in London, and then he decided to do an experiment. So he got 4 of his friends from the Royal Society, and they went to watch the show together, and they positioned themselves around the stage in different places. And one of them was a real specialist in the making of things, and mechanics. And so they watched very carefully, they made sort of mental notes of what was going on, and at the end of the show, they went home to Desaguliers' house, where he had his own sort of carpentry laboratory shop, because he was also an inventor, and they tried to see if they could replicate his feats. And they could. Not all of them, not immediately, but they could replicate a lot of them. And so Desaguliers, inspired by this, then thought, well, okay, what about the big lift? And so he made his own tower. So he could also stand above the weight, put the chains through the hole, And of course, if you know anything, if you've all been on a swing in a playground at some time in your childhood, this is like the most simple mechanics of all. You pull those things in. So if the chains are going to go through that hole, they get pinched and the weight comes up. And so Descouliers, and I didn't put another slide of him in because of time constraints, but clearly not the most athletic looking person that we've seen come through. Descouliers himself was able to lift enormous weights because of the way the mechanics of the machine worked. So Descouliers then reported all this at a meeting of the Royal Society. And this, of course, became for von Eckenberg a sort of, public humiliation because he was outed for doing these sort of fake acts and everything. But it inspired Descouliers and others to begin thinking a little bit more about this. And so throughout his long career, and Descouliers actually was awarded the Copley Medal by the Royal Society on 3 different occasions, which is their highest award for science. So he was not somebody who was just like the strength guy. He was doing all kinds of great work, but this was also kind of his side passion. So over the next several decades of his life, strength remained kind of a constant theme with Descouliers. These drawings are some of his analyses trying to show the different forces that were at work in some of the things that the early strongmen did. Descouliers argued, for example, that if you were going to try to withstand the pull of a horse, that you had a better mechanical advantage if you had your legs slightly up rather than doing it flat. The thing on the ground that looks like to me at first a rock is actually supposed to be a feather bed. And because the act there is breaking a rope. And so by doing the rope break up against in that angle, the argument was it's more efficient than trying to do it against the ground. So I'm not, as Jody knows, this is not my field. But I think these guys are interesting, and I think we've kind of missed their story in the bigger picture of all this. So there's another player in all this for Descouliers who also helps his thinking, and that's a strong man, a real strong man, whose name is Thomas Topham. And there won't be time today for me to tell his story, but one of the things that you should know about Topham, because he sort of factors into other things along the way, was that he, unlike von Eckenberg, Descouliers regarded as a real strong man. Topham actually had unusual strength. He gave public exhibitions occasionally, and he actually also did a platform lift, this one with some 1,800 pounds in these 3 big hogsheads. But the thing about Topham, and this Descouliers writes also about, is that rather than doing this in some sort of regular way, Topham just takes a leather strap, puts it over his neck, and attaches it to the weight and picks it up. So what I know of biomechanics is that's not necessarily your strongest position. This would be much better around the hips, over the large bones of the pelvis, I would think. But nonetheless, Topham was unusual. And in fact, reading some of the stuff that I was looking at later for this talk, reading actually some of the stuff about, the whole, will there ever be people with double muscles after we have genetic engineering? Topham might have been somewhat on that edge himself. So, but that's another day. So, following all this, Descouliers decides, okay, if we're going to talk about strength scientists, then we have to have some way to accurately measure it. And so he begins working with a man named George Graham, who's a talented inventor, and the two of them decide they'll invent some dynamometers. So the Descouliers-Graham dynamometers are among the first ever invented in the world. And this one on the right here is an invention of his that he thought would allow you to test that biceps muscle that he was looking at. It was supposed to be able to test, not grip, but to test that. And so your stationary hand would go there. The other hand actually went out here. And then you sort of pulled it in. The metallic part of this is, of course, what they used to call a steelyard scale, and so you would sort of move the weight out further. The one on the left, this one is to test hip and back strength, and the one down below there was actually an invention to test grip strength. This, of course, would not have gotten very far in the 19th century in our physical education classes because they're so big and so unwieldy. But their inspiration allowed other people to also start thinking about how do we measure strength. And it wasn't very long before Edna Renier's dynamometer came into being. And this was, of course, first produced in 1698. And it was much smarter, very portable. And so what we see then is that very quickly in this century where there isn't really much else that I know of going on in sports science, but this question about how we measure strength becomes very important to people. Renier's dynamometer, of course, was portable, and you could adapt it in different ways with different chains and attachments. So you could test hip and back strength there. You could use it for grip. You could pull against it. You could do a variety of things. And when I first came to UT, there was actually one very much like it in the old gymnasium where I had my original office. So I think they haven't totally gone out of use. So what the Renier dynamometer, of course, proved popular with academics, with researchers, with military people. And it wasn't very long before we began to actually see some reports in scientific circles about maximal strength. So in Desigualier's time, the word was that the strength exerted by the biceps was supposed to be about 300 pounds. And then norms were suggested by Desigualier's statement that in tests of back and leg strength, that the strongest man, he argued, would pull about 400 pounds, and the weakest man, or those who are in health and not too fat, would lift only about 125 pounds. So the strong are going to be doing 400, the weak about 125 pounds. And so the point of this is, by the end of the 18th century, we have records. We actually begin to have human records. Not necessarily the kind of records that we think about today, but we have some documentation suggesting that this is some of the range of human limitations. So let's talk about records. So 100 years after this time I was just speaking of, the use of dynamometers was really commonplace. In the United States, as our field struggled to find an academic and scientific base, measuring and testing the human body, or physical anthropometry as it was called, became our first sub-discipline. Interestingly, as data began to be collected in college physical education classes, the strength of average young men became a matter of speculation and interest, since no one worried about privacy issues in the late 19th century. In other words, there was no human subjects research at that time. Student scores were actually used as proof by physical educators that their systems were actually working. In 1897, dynamometer strength tests even became an early form of intercollegiate sport. When 15 Ivy League universities had a meeting, joined together, set up rules and regulations about exactly how they would test and what the tests would do. And what they would then do is they would take, so they blew into a spirometer, they did grip test strengths, of course, they did pull-ups, they did chin-ups, and then they did a battery of tests using dynamometers. All of those scores were then added together. You got your total score. And the universities could actually claim bragging rights, as being the strongest university. We had the strongest students. And some collegians, like Henry Lane here in 1895, could actually become known as the strongest college boy in America. So I've thought about this because I am interested in weightlifting. I actually think this predates any other weightlifting association that existed in America. It was really this actually may be our first weightlifting records. So because universities, though, were focusing their strength interests largely on measurements, and the strength of average men, real weightlifting, even though it was included in the 1896 Olympic Games, didn't really ever become part of most university sport offerings. And so from that time forward, it really was run largely by private entrepreneurs until finally in 1922, we established an organization for weightlifting. And that organization, I should note, when it began, instead of just having the lifts that were part of the Olympic Games within its list of records, they actually they actually recognized over 40 different records in the beginning of the American Continental Weightlifting Association. Now that's a lot of records, but we love records. And athletes love the idea that they can hold a record. And that's one of our great motivations for training. And so, as Alan Gutman has pointed out to us in his wonderful seminal work in the field of sports studies, that was the keeping of records was one of the things that actually moved sport from these kind of early, kind of confused roots into the idea of having modernity. It was records that were stimulated by the fact that in the late 19th century there was this convergence of forces. We saw the introduction of sport pages. We saw the emergence of sport promoters who came to view records as economic boons and actually would sometimes set up special circumstances so records could be set. We saw a new technology emerge that made a great difference to this, the stopwatch. All of a sudden in the late 19th century, you could actually keep time in fifths of seconds. So that was a big deal, a fifth of a second. And of course, the rise of governance associations who claimed control of their particular part of the sporting turf by codifying rules and establishing official records for their sport all helped. But I think one of the biggest influences, of course college sports also mattered, but one of the most important influences, especially for the public, was the emergence or the re-emergence of the Olympic Games, which happens in 1896. Because those games provided us with another set of records, another set of prestigious goals for athletes to aim at, and it also gave reporters more stories for their papers, stories that often speculated about man's relationship to world records and whether there would eventually be a time when man had reached his ultimate limits. So during the first 2 decades of the 20th century, as I've examined this literature now, the breaking of new collegiate world and American records was common. Sport, after all, was still pretty new. There was lots of, timing is often everything in records. And yet, even in these first couple decades of the 20th century, some journalists were already predicting that we were getting close to our physiological limits. In 1912, for example, a Washington Post article, 1912, of course, was an Olympic year. That was Stockholm. 1912, the Washington Post article proudly titled, "The United States has more record breakers in athletics than any other country in the world." That was the headline. The United States has more record breakers than anybody else in the world. And that article closed by musing, "From year to year one wonders." As he looks over the records of the athletes in track and field sports, if the time will ever come when the limits of speed, endurance, agility, and skill will be reached. Similarly, in 1915, after Norman Tabor, who you can see here, I jumped ahead a bit, ran a mile in an astonishing time of 4 minutes, 12 3/5 seconds, which broke professional runner Walter George's record that had been set nearly 30 years earlier, I should note. The Scientific American author George Meade similarly asked if we were not already near the end of human capacities. Meade's short paper, by the way, was a primarily, I would call it a descriptive, quantitative analysis of running records based on time and distance. And Meade predicted that when we looked at the records of what he called traditional races, by those which he meant races that had been around for a long time, like the 100 and the 200 meters and the dashes, and the mile, that we would see a slower rate of growth over time than in those sports which were relatively new since the adoption of the Olympic Games, say like pole vaulting. Meade writes, in fact, quote, "So many thousands of men have striven to break these traditional records that they may be as closely approximating the best which man can do, rather than as representing the best which man has done so far." So they were representing the best that we can do, these records, rather than what we've done so far. So just to make sure that sank in, what Meade is really saying back in 1916 was that he felt in those popular events like the 100 and the mile that we were already close to our physiological limits. So another person that most of you will recognize also weighed in on this debate. The eminent physiologist A.V. Hill wrote an article in the Scientific Monthly in 1925 in which he presented his own analysis of athletic records. Hill examined time, distance, and of course fatigue as they all related to sporting records in his article. And he then concluded with the interesting suggestion, which has actually come not so interesting in the sense that it has actually happened, is he suggested that the field of physiology could aid sport in the quest for higher levels of performance. Wrote Hill, the practice of athletics is both a science and an art. And if physiology can aid in the development of athletics as a science and an art, I think it will deserve well of mankind. So predating what we do here. How much physiology helped the track and field athletes at the 1936 Olympic Games is actually not known, but it was 11 years after Hill's statement. Because at that Olympic Games, although we were theoretically close to our limits, we actually had 20 new Olympic records set and 6 new world records set by the men in Berlin. And there were 4 new Olympic records and 1 world record set by women there, which caused more than one journalist to look for explanations. Now, I don't have any evidence to suggest that physiology helped anyone in Berlin, and maybe unless it was the Germans. But there were clearly other factors that played a role. The Washington Post argued that the high number of records in Berlin could at least partly be explained by improved equipment, improved techniques, like the new Western roll that they were using in the high jump, and the sprinters' new crouch start, where they actually went out on the track and dug little holes with trowels so they could put their feet in and get a lower start. The Post, in fact, though, saw all this as very positive, and they argued that they saw no reason to think that records would not continue to be broken in the future, arguing that these improvements made the settings of records more likely. So, as the Olympic Games became more important and more widely covered by the media, articles examining the idea of the ultimate limits of human performance began to appear pretty much like clockwork every 4 years or so around the time of the Olympic Games. And by the latter half of the 20th century, the expert voices talking about this in the newspapers and the magazines were often members of the sports science community. In 1956, M.H. Litsky of the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee predicted in an article in Science that records would definitely be broken at the upcoming Melbourne Olympic Games. He actually provided numbers for how they would be broken, and he also suggested that we should all remember that sport records will always be considered best efforts and not ultimates, because better training methods, better nutrition, and improved tracks and equipment will make future sport different than it was in 1956. In 1960, as the world was getting ready for the Rome Olympic Games, the distinguished physician Sir Adolph Abrahams, 4-time team physician for Britain, founder of British sports science, took the opposite view and reported at the annual meeting of the British Medical Association that he felt current world records were very close to the limits of human performance and suggested that new records would be unlikely in Rome because of the high climate. Abrahamson, of course, was wrong. There were 28 new Olympic track and field records in Rome and 3 world records set by the men there. And the women who were competing there also set new world records. In fact, they set Olympic records in every single event. We only had 10 for women there. And Wilma Rudolph led the American team to an Olympic record in the 4x100 meters. 6 years later, Erling Asmussen of Copenhagen University was asked for his thoughts on the progression of world records. He suggested that while he felt they were getting closer to our limits in foot races, he argued that the field events, because of increases in height and weight of man, were not yet close. So Asmussen was subscribing to the idea that we're getting bigger as people. 1968, following Bob Beeman's astonishing world record in the long jump, sports scientist Ernst Joeckel told reporters that Beeman's 8.9-meter jump will not be repeated in the lifetime of the present generation, and further said he believed it approached the potentialities of man. In 1981, when talking about Beeman's jump on another occasion, Joeckel actually referred to it as a mutation performance and told reporters that it should not have arrived until the 21st century. This, of course, was before 1991, when Beeman's record was broken. So in 1988, think Seoul, Journalist Gina Collada again posed questions about the limits of modern sport. Dave Costel, then at Ball State, reported to Collada that although the incremental differences between records were getting smaller, that he believed the only sports in which we would not continue to see improvement were those in which you can earn a perfect score, like bowling, or perhaps gymnastics, where earning perfect tens on every element would probably be game over for gymnastics. So I want to end my analysis here. I know I'm getting close on my time, and talk just about one final thing. So in looking at this literature, and obviously I didn't come all the way up into the modern era, but believe me, every 4 years it comes up again. 2008, we were done with records. It was over, but here we are, still after this. In looking at the literature, those who believe we are approaching the limits of human performance tend to be people whose remarks do not include consideration of new technologies, new kinds of athletes, or drugs. If we think about Thomas Rogers, who wrote in 1981 in the New York Times, for example, Rogers actually wrote at that time, this says, quote, "Unless a larger heart is developed, it's unlikely that man will ever be able to run a mile faster than 3 minutes and 34 seconds. So in that same article, Rogers then explains that Russian scientists have predicted that the fastest a man, let me pull that forward, because in truth, we haven't quite made that set yet. The world record in the mile is actually now at 3:43.13. We're getting close, but we haven't actually met that record yet, but we're right there. That same article, though, Rogers predicts that the fastest a man will ever be able to run the 100 meters is 9.75 seconds. And as we all know, that prediction wasn't worth the paper it was written on. Usain Bolt has broken the 9.75 barrier several times and now holds the world record at 9.58. And finally, I want to return and close, last I promise, to Captain America, who you'll recall at the beginning of my talk, I mentioned that he had to train to maintain his strength. And the illustration up in the corner shows him bench pressing 1,100 pounds. When those images were drawn, my guess is that the author and the illustrator chose 1,100 as a weight that was so far out there that there was no way any regular human being would ever be able to approach that weight. Because he's a superhero. He has to be better than human. Well, I'd like to introduce you to my neighbor in Texas, whose name is Paul Tiny Meeker. And Tiny has now bench pressed over 1,100 pounds on several occasions, recently broke through and did what he claims is 1137. However, those records are made because of the fact that they have moved in certain aspects of the sport of powerlifting to all kinds of new supportive gear. And so the shirt that he has on there is appropriately fitted. Its task is to serve as a slingshot so that when he brings the weight down, it is so tight upon his arms and shoulders that he can't possibly get that bar down to his shelf. And in fact, when they do bench presses in the association that allows this, the men actually hand the bar out. And they often will put a block of wood in to help stretch the shirt a couple of times before you take your whole attempt. It is completely different than anything that I did in my lifetime, completely different than anything that's done in certain federations. But what has happened, and it's funny to come back to powerlifting twice today in this meeting, but what's happened in powerlifting is that the quest for records means we now have lots of associations. There are actually over 30 different American powerlifting associations now with different sets of records, and it's all driven by this same desire. So my closing thought for all of you, as you watch sport, think about all this, is that as we start moving into the brave new world, which I suspect will include some genetic engineering of athletes, don't be surprised if people are willing to do as Tiny Meekers and others do, and continue to try to find ways to use whatever technologies are out there. And so, in closing to Carl, we need a new question. We need to be able to talk about humans who aren't either structurally or chemically enhanced, and then I think we can talk about records. Thank you.